In a city where everyone is running from something, Moira Danby was the only one running toward the gunfire. She wasn't a hero, and she wasn't a spy. She was just a delivery girl, with a package that would decide the fate of Seoul's most dangerous man. Seoul is a sea of 10 million strangers, and for Moira, survival meant becoming its most efficient ghost. Her life didn't happen in offices or cafes. It happened in the high RPM hum of a motorcycle engine and the rain-slicked neon reflections of the Han River. At 26, Moira had perfected the choreography of the invisible. She wore her navy delivery vest like armor, her hair pulled back in a knot that never dared to come loose, and her eyes always fixed on the next GPS coordinate. She lived by a singular, cold rule: deliver the package. Don't look inside. Never stay for the reaction. 5 years ago, she had arrived in the capital with a suitcase full of secrets and a need to disappear. She had hoped for a life in the light, but the city only offered her the shadows of the gig economy. Now she was the pulse of the underworld's logistics, the anonymous hand bridging the gap between the ultra-rich in their penthouses and the dark errands they were too afraid to run themselves. She told herself the hollow ache in her chest was just the wind chill from the road, ignoring the truth that she was delivering everyone else's future while she had completely abandoned her own. She was a master of the exit, never realizing that her next delivery at the Lotte Signal Gala would be the one time she'd finally have to stand her ground. The humidity of Seoul in late August felt like a wet wool blanket, but at 60 miles per hour, the air turned into a sharp, cooling blade. Moira Danby leaned her bike into a tight curve near the Mapo Bridge, the neon lights of the city blurring into long, electric ribbons of violet and gold. To the thousands of people stuck in the gridlock of the Gangnam district, she was nothing more than a momentary roar of an engine and a flash of a navy blue vest. To the dispatchers at the agency, she was simply Unit 702, a dot on a digital map that moved with a precision that defied the chaos of the streets. Moira's world was defined by the narrow space between her handlebars. Every delivery was a mission of calculated silence. She didn't care if the padded envelope in her crossbody strap contained a divorce settlement, a bribe, or a diamond necklace meant for a mistress. In her 5 years on the road, she had learned that curiosity was a luxury that people like her couldn't afford. Knowledge was a weight, and she already carried enough of that beneath her ribs. Her philosophy was simple: be fast, be invisible, and never, under any circumstances, look the client in the eye. As she pulled up to a red light, the vibration of the idling engine traveled up her arms, a familiar tremor that matched the steady, lonely beat of her heart. She adjusted her gloves, her gaze fixed on the countdown of the pedestrian signal. Seoul was a city built on the visible: the towering skyscrapers, the plastic surgery clinics, the bright lights of the Lotte World Tower. But Moira lived in the invisible gaps. She moved through the service elevators, the back alleys, and the loading docks. She was the ghost that kept the city's secrets moving, while her own past remained locked away in a small, windowless studio apartment in Incheon. The light turned green, and she opened the throttle. The sudden surge of adrenaline was the only thing that made her feel alive anymore. It drowned out the memories of what she had left behind, the dreams of a life where she wasn't always running. She told herself she liked the solitude, that the helmet was a shield against a world that had forgotten how to be kind. But as she sped toward the Lotte Signal for her final drop-off of the night, a strange prickle of intuition climbed the back of her neck. The manifest for this delivery was different. No name, just a floor number and a high security clearance code that had bypassed the usual encryption. She didn't know it yet, but the no questions rule she had built her life around was about to be shattered by a man who lived in the very heart of the storm she was trying to outrun. For the first time in 5 years, Moira Danby wasn't just delivering a package, she was delivering herself into the hands of fate. The Lotte Signal was a fortress of glass and gold, rising into the clouds like a monument to Seoul's untouchable elite. As Moira pulled into the underground service bay, the air changed. It lost the grit of the street and took on the scent of expensive cologne and ozone. She bypassed the glittering main lobby, moving through a series of gray, sterile corridors where her heavy boots echoed against the polished concrete. She felt like a blemish on the building's perfection, a navy-clad ghost haunting the edges of a world she didn't belong to. The package in her vest, a weight no larger than a brick but infinitely more significant, seemed to pulse against her chest as she scanned her high-level clearance at the service elevator. When the doors opened on the grand ballroom level, the transition was jarring. The air was thick with the chime of crystal and the low, rehearsed hum of 100 powerful conversations. Through the cracked door of the service entrance, she saw him, Kwon Isyon. He stood at the center of the room, a pillar of black silk and controlled stillness. Even from a distance, the tattoo on his neck looked like a warning written in ink. He wasn't talking, he was observing, his eyes moving with a predatory calm that made the socialites around him look like fluttering birds. Moirae checked her watch, 10:42 p.m. She was exactly on time, yet the atmosphere felt dangerously coiled. Suddenly, the crystalline light of the chandeliers didn't just flicker, it died. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a silence so heavy it felt physical. Then came the sound that Moirae knew better than any music, the sharp, metallic shink of steel being drawn from sheaths. In the darkness, the emergency lights bled a dim, ghostly red onto the floor. The silent board had made its move. Shadows moved with lethal intent toward the man in the center of the room. Panic erupted, a wave of silk and perfume rushing toward the exits, but Moirae didn't move backward. She felt the familiar snap of her own focus narrowing. Her no questions rule didn't apply to a hit. This wasn't a delivery anymore. It was a choice. As a blade caught the red light just inches from Ision's back, Moirae kicked the service door open. She didn't shout, she didn't scream. She simply ran toward the eye of the storm, her hand reaching into her vest for the cold, heavy salvation she had been hired to bring. She was a delivery girl in a room full of monsters, and she was about to show them that some ghosts carry more than just messages. The scream of the crowd was a distant roar, muffled by the sudden surge of blood in Moirae's ears. She moved through the darkness not as a victim, but as a ghost who finally had a purpose. Kwon Isyon stood at the center of the carnage, his back to the looming shadow of an assassin whose blade was already descending in a silver arc. He didn't flinch, he didn't even turn. It was as if he were waiting for the end with the same cold composure he used to run his empire. But Moirae was faster. She bridged the gap in 3 strides, her navy vest a blur in the red emergency light. She didn't call out, noise was for the desperate. Instead, she reached into the hidden compartment of her crossbody strap and pulled out the custom handgun, its matte finish sucking in the dim light. She stepped into his personal space, a territory where most men died for trespassing, and pressed the cold weight of the weapon into his open palm. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Their hands met around the grip, her fingers steady and calloused from years of gripping handlebars, his palm warm and unexpectedly smooth. The contrast was electric. Ision's eyes, dark and unreadable, shifted from the chaos to her face. In that split second, he didn't see a delivery girl. He saw an anomaly. He saw a woman who looked at death and didn't blink. With a fluid, practiced motion, Ision's fingers closed over hers, a silent acknowledgement that felt like a blood oath. He didn't ask how she got in or why she was helping him. He simply accepted the gift. He pivoted, the weapon becoming an extension of his arm, and a single suppressed thud echoed through the hall as the assassin collapsed. The threat wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted. Ision looked back at her, his slicked back hair still perfect despite the violence blooming around them. A small, dangerous grin tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first crack in his composed monster mask. "You're late," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that cut through the panic. Moira didn't pull her hand away immediately. She felt the heat radiating from him, a stark contrast to the cold steel they were both holding. "I was on time," she countered, her voice low and fearless. The world just got in the way. At that moment, the delivery girl and the Mafia boss weren't strangers anymore. They were 2 halves of a violent equation that the silent board had never bothered to calculate. The delivery was complete, but as the remaining gunmen closed in, Moira realized she wasn't leaving. For the first time in 5 years, she had found something worth staying for. The adrenaline from the gala had long since soured into a dull, throbbing ache by the time Moira returned to her studio apartment in Incheon. She sat on the edge of her narrow cot, the silence of the room feeling louder than the gunfire she had fled. She had broken her only rule. She had stayed for the reaction. She had looked into the eyes of a monster and felt a spark of something that wasn't fear. She told herself it was a one-time glitch, a momentary lapse in her choreography of survival. She would go back to being Unit 702. She would go back to being invisible. But the city of Seoul was a machine, and Kwon Isan owned the gears. 3 days later, Moira was weaving through the rain-drenched alleys of Mapo-gu when her GPS didn't just reroute, it died. The screen of her mounted phone flickered to black, then bled into a deep, bruised crimson. A single line of text appeared. "Pull over. The delivery is incomplete." Before she could reach for her kickstand, 2 black sedans ghosted out of the downpour, boxing her bike against a brick wall with surgical precision. Moira didn't reach for a weapon this time. She knew she was outmatched. She stood her ground, her navy vest soaked through, her hair plastered to her forehead. The rear door of the lead car opened, and a pair of handmade Italian leather shoes met the oily pavement. Isan stepped out, shielded by a large black umbrella held by a silent subordinate. In the dim light of the alley, his neck tattoo seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the city. He didn't look like a man who had survived an assassination attempt 72 hours ago. He looked like a man who was bored with the world's attempts to stop him. "I spent 48 hours trying to find a name for the ghost who saved my life," Isan said, his voice a low melodic friction against the sound of the rain. "My security team said you didn't exist. No digital footprint, no social history. You're a ghost in the machine, Moira Danby." The sound of her real name coming from his lips felt like a physical touch. "I'm a courier," she replied, her voice steady beside the cold. "The delivery was made. We're even." "We are far from even," Isan countered, stepping closer until the edge of his umbrella sheltered her from the rain. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped her. "My board is filled with men who use gold to hide their rot. They track every phone, every car, every digital breath I take. I don't need a soldier and I don't need a spy. I need someone who knows how to move through the gaps they can't see." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small encrypted drive. "I have a mission that requires a phantom, someone who can deliver the truth to the only allies I have left without leaving a single trace in the light. No one else can do this, Moira, because no one else is brave enough to be nobody." Moira looked at the driver, then at the man who had seen her when she was most hidden. She realized then that once you let a monster see you, there is no going back to the shadows. She reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the drive, a silent acceptance of a new, much more dangerous contract. The transition from being a ghost to being a partner was not made of words, but of shared silence and the smell of cooling rain on hot asphalt. Moira sat on her bike outside a discreet warehouse in Seongsu-dong, the engine ticking as it cooled. Isan stood beside her, his tailored suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the full extent of the ink crawling up his arms. For the first time, he wasn't the untouchable boss behind a mahogany desk. He was a man deep in the mechanics of a war he hadn't asked for. He handed her a weathered leather satchel, his fingers brushing against the scarred knuckles of her right hand, the permanent reminders of a crash 3 years ago that she never talked about. He didn't look away. Most people flinched at the sight of her rough, hard-working hands, but Isan's gaze was clinical, yet strangely reverent. He saw the history written in her skin, the narrow escapes, the falls, and the relentless will to get back up. "The rules are different tonight," Isan murmured, his voice barely rising above the distant hum of the city. "You aren't just delivering data, you're delivering a lifeline to a family in the Guro district. My board wants to pave over their lives to build a shopping mall. They think power is about erasing people. I need you to prove them wrong." Moira looked at the satchel, then back at him. She saw the exhaustion etched in the corners of his eyes, the heavy weight of 10,000 lives resting on his shoulders. He wasn't just a monster of the underworld. He was the only thing standing between the vulnerable and the truly heartless. The rules of the road she had lived by, never care, never look back, felt flimsy in the face of his burden. "Why me?" she asked, her voice cracking the stillness. "You have soldiers, you have armored cars." Isan leaned against the brick wall, the shadows playing across the sharp angles of his face. Soldiers attract fire, armored cars attract attention, but you move like the wind through a keyhole. I saw your scars, Moira. You don't get those by playing it safe. You get them by refusing to stop. That's the only kind of person I can trust with this. For a moment, the distance between the Mafia boss and the delivery girl vanished. He wasn't her employer, and she wasn't his tool. They were just two people who had been broken by the city and decided to use the pieces to build something else. Moira adjusted her helmet, the visor clicking into place. She felt the weight of the satchel, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a purpose. As she kicked the bike into gear, she realized that Isan hadn't just hired her to deliver a package, he had hired her to help him carry the world. And for the first time in 5 years, she didn't want to run away from the destination. The rain had tapered off into a fine, clinging mist that turned the city into a watercolor painting. They were parked beneath the rusted iron skeleton of an overpass, a place where the sound of the traffic above provided a steady, rhythmic insulation from the rest of the world. Isan sat on a concrete pylon, the orange glow of his cigarette the only warmth in the damp gray. Moira stood by her bike, her helmet off, letting the cool air hit her face for the first time in hours. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They had reached the point where words felt like a clumsy interruption. In their world, silence wasn't empty. It was a language of its own, a way of measuring the other person's pulse without touching them. "You never stop moving, do you?" Isan's voice was a low rasp, cutting through the hum of the city. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the tattoo that spiraled up his forearm and disappeared into his collar. Moira looked down at her gloveless hands. She was right. Her fingers were curled, as if still gripping the wind. "Moving is the only way to stay ahead of the things that want to catch you," she whispered. "If I stop, the past catches up. The version of me that lost everything, she's always just a few seconds behind my rear tire. As long as I'm at 80 miles per hour, she can't touch me." Isan took a slow drag, the light illuminating the sharp, weary lines of his face. He reached up, tracing the ink on his neck, a complex pattern of scales and shadows that looked like a dragon trying to break free from his skin. "People think this is a badge of power," he said, his smile devoid of any warmth. "A symbol of the monster they want me to be. But it's not for them. It's a map of everyone I've failed. Every scale is a name I couldn't protect. It's heavy, Moira. It's a weight that never lets me sleep." He looked at her then, and for the first time, the composed monster was gone. In his eyes, she saw the same exhausting velocity she lived by, the desperate need to outrun a destiny that felt like a cage. He wasn't the boss, and she wasn't the courier. They were two people whose lives had been written in scars and ink, trying to find a reason to slow down. Moira stepped closer, her shadow merging with his on the damp pavement. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the ink on his neck. She didn't touch him, but the heat between them was more intense than any contact. "Maybe," she murmured, her voice steady for the first time that night, "we aren't running away. Maybe we're just waiting for someone fast enough to catch us." Isan let out a long, shaky breath, the smoke curling around them like a secret. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of two ghosts passing in the night. It was the quiet of two people who had finally found a place where they didn't have to hide their wounds. In the heart of the neon city, they had found a single moment of stillness, and for the first time in 5 years, Moira didn't feel the urge to start her engine. The fragile piece of the overpass was shattered 48 hours later by a digital scream. Moira was mid-route, threading through the dense, neon-soaked labyrinth of the Dong Diamoon market when her bike's dashboard erupted in a strobe of amber warnings. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a remote override. Her engine sputtered, coughing against her command, as the silent board finally stopped treating her like a nuisance and started treating her like a target. They had realized that she wasn't just a courier. She was Ision's nervous system, the untraceable thread connecting him to his survival. To cut the thread was to bleed the man dry. A sleek, windowless van swerved from a side street, its tires screeching against the wet pavement as it tried to pin her against a row of metal market stalls. Moira downshifted, her knuckles white against the grips, forcing the bike to scream as she hopped a curb. The heavy satchel against her hip, containing the final evidence needed to topple the board, felt like a thermal detonator. If she went down, Ision's last chance at a legitimate legacy died with her. The attackers weren't using silencers this time. A window in the van slid open, and a staccato rhythm of automatic fire tore through the air, shattering a display of glass lanterns beside her. The world became a kaleidoscope of falling shards and screaming pedestrians. Moira leaned so low, her knee puck brushed the asphalt, her heart hammering a frantic code against her ribs. She was back in the velocity she feared, the kind where the past catches up and swallows the future whole. She reached for her comms, but the frequency was jammed with a high-pitched whine. She was alone in the dark, caught in a kill box designed by men who moved money like chess pieces. As a second car joined the pursuit, boxing her into a narrow alleyway that dead-ended at the river, Moira felt a cold realization settle in her gut. They didn't just want the package, they wanted to erase the ghost in the machine, to prove that no one was untouchable. For the first time, the speed wasn't enough. She wasn't outrunning her past anymore. She was staring at her ending. As she skidded to a halt at the edge of the dark, swirling waters of the Han River, the headlights of her pursuers bathed her in a cruel, artificial spotlight. She reached into her vest, not for a weapon, but for the drive Ision had given her. If she was going to disappear, she would make sure his truth didn't go with her. But as the doors of the van slid open, a familiar, low roar echoed from the other side of the bridge, a sound that didn't belong to the board's polished fleet, but to a man who had promised that some ghosts were worth hunting for. The headlights of the board's sedans cut through the mist like the eyes of deep-sea predators, pinning Moira against the rusted railing of the riverbank. She could hear the heavy thud of doors opening, the rhythmic click of tactical boots on the wet asphalt. She was trapped in the very thing she had spent 5 years avoiding, a dead end. Her hand tightened around the encrypted drive in her vest, the plastic edges biting into her palm. She looked at the churning black water of the Han River and wondered if the current was faster than her bike. Suddenly, the air didn't just vibrate, it shattered. A thunderous, guttural roar tore through the alley, the sound of a high-performance engine being pushed to its absolute limit. From the darkness of the bridge's upper tier, a lone black motorcycle plummeted, catching a terrifying second of air before slamming onto the pavement with a shower of sparks. It wasn't a courier's bike, it was a beast of carbon fiber and rage. Kwan Isan didn't slide to a halt, he weaponized his momentum. He laid the bike down, using the heavy frame to sweep the legs out from the first 2 gunmen before he had even fully dismounted. He stood up in a single, fluid motion, his black suit jacket fluttering like a crow's wings. For the first time, the calm, composed monster was gone, replaced by something much more primitive. He had broken every rule of his own security protocol, leaving his armored convoy and his bodyguards behind. He had come alone, trading his empire's safety for a single, invisible girl. "Get behind me," he commanded, his voice no longer a low rasp, but a blade of cold command. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the men who had dared to touch his unknown variable. Moira didn't hesitate. She stepped into the heat of his shadow, the smell of burnt rubber and expensive sandalwood grounding her. As the board's men recovered and raised their weapons, Isan didn't reach for a gun. He reached for her hand. His grip was bruising, a desperate anchoring of two people who had spent their lives trying to be ghosts. "You're a fool," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and a new, dangerous warmth. "You risked everything for a delivery." Isan pivoted, shielding her body with his own as the first volley of gunfire erupted, the bullets sparking off the iron railings. "I didn't come for the package, Moira," he said, the ink on his neck glowing under the artificial lights. "I came for the person who carries it." At that moment, the price of the delivery became clear. It wasn't about the evidence or the board. It was about the fact that they were no longer outrunning the world separately. They were standing in the center of the storm, and for the first time in her life, Moira didn't want to be fast. She just wanted to be right there. The headquarters of the White Tiger Syndicate was a monolith of steel and shadow, its top floor a glass cage that overlooked the sprawling, indifferent lights of Seoul. Inside, the silent board sat around a mahogany table, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of monitors as they prepared to sign away Isan's legacy. They believed they had won. They believed the ghost was drowned, and the monster was broken. They didn't realize that when you push two people who have nothing to lose into a corner, you don't get a surrender, you get a revolution. The elevator doors didn't open with a chime. They were forced apart by a steel pry bar. Moira stepped out first, her navy vest torn and stained with river water, her eyes burning with a focused, lethal heat. Beside her, Iseon moved like a shadow given form, his shirt sleeves rolled up, the dragon on his neck appearing to writhe in the flickering overhead lights. They didn't need to speak. The hours they had spent in the silence of the city had created a shared frequency, a synchronization of intent that no amount of training could replicate. As the board's security detail lunged forward, Moira and Iseon moved in a terrifying, beautiful symmetry. When Moira dropped low to sweep a guard's legs, Iseon was already there to deliver the finishing blow. When Iseon drew the fire of the lead assassin, Moira used the momentum of her courier's bag to disarm him from the blind side. It was a dance of survival, a staccato rhythm of bone hitting concrete and the sharp, metallic click of empty magazines being discarded. They were the ghost and the machine, finally integrated, moving through the room with the inevitability of a storm. Iseon reached the head of the table just as the chairman reached for a hidden panic button. With a movement too fast for the eye to follow, Iseon pinned the man's hand to the mahogany with a heavy silver fountain pen, the last signature the board would ever see. Moira stood at Iseon's shoulder, her hand resting on the small of his back, the encrypted drive held high for all to see. The evidence of their corruption wasn't just on the disk, it was written in the blood and sweat of the two people they had tried to erase. The room went still. The silent board looked at the delivery girl they had dismissed and the boss they had betrayed, and for the first time, they felt the weight of the world they had tried to steal. Iseon didn't pull the trigger. He didn't have to. He simply looked at Moira, a silent question in his dark eyes. She nodded, her hand tightening against his back. They had delivered the truth, and in the cold, clear light of the high-rise, the monsters were finally unmasked. The empire was still standing, but the rules had changed forever. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the architects of what came next. The chaos of the headquarters eventually settled into a quiet, blue-tinged morning. The sirens in the distance were no longer a threat, but a cleanup crew for a world that had been set right. Iseon and Moira stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the wind whipping at his loose silk tie and her tangled hair. For the first time, the city below didn't look like a series of obstacles or a grid of escape routes. It just looked like home. Iseon turned to her, the morning light hatching the dragon scales on his neck. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metallic object, not a weapon and not a ring, but a key stamped with a white tiger and a lightning bolt. "I'm rebuilding the syndicate from the bones up," he said, his voice regaining its rich, melodic friction. I don't want people who follow orders because they're afraid. I want people who move because they care about what's at the other end of the road. There is a permanent place for you here, Moira. No more navy vests, no more anonymous drops. Moira looked at the key, then at her own hands. The scars were still there, but they didn't feel like marks of shame anymore. They felt like a map of her resilience. She realized then that belonging wasn't about finding a place to hide. It wasn't about being untraceable or fast. True belonging was the courage to be seen, to stop the motorcycle, and to let someone else carry the weight of the helmet. I'll take the job, she whispered, her fingers closing over the metal. But I'm not staying in the penthouse. I'll be on the streets, because the people in the gaps still need someone to deliver the truth. Isaon smiled, a genuine human expression that reached his eyes. He understood. They had learned that power isn't found in a holster or a bank account. It's found in the reliability of a person who shows up when the lights go out. They had redefined their lives not by what they were outrunning, but by what they were willing to protect. The most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a gun. It's a person who has nothing to lose and finally finds someone worth protecting. If this story moved you, hit like and tell us in the comments, would you trust a stranger with your life if they were the only one who showed up? Follow us for more stories where the invisible become unforgettable. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.